February 19th, 1942. Darwin, Northern Australia. The sun had barely risen over the harbour when the air raid sirens began to scream. 242 Japanese aircraft filled the sky like a dark storm cloud moving toward the city. It was the largest air raid since Pearl Harbor, and the people below knew what was coming. This is the story of how Australian pilots would do something so unexpected, so different, that even Japanese admirals would later admit these flyers changed everything they thought they knew about air combat. Within minutes, the peaceful morning exploded into chaos. The numbers tell the horror of that day. 188 Japanese bombers flew in perfect formation, protected by 54 Zero fighters. These Zeros were the best fighter planes in the Pacific, faster and more agile than almost anything the Allies could put in the air. Below them, Darwin had only 12 operational aircraft ready to fight, 12 against 242. The math was simple and terrifying. In the harbour, ships sat like sitting ducks. Within 40 minutes, 8 ships sank beneath the waves, 23 more burned or lay destroyed. The Japanese pilots flew with precision and confidence. They had done this before. They knew they would win. Across the entire Pacific theatre, the story was the same everywhere. Japanese pilots were winning and winning big. For every one Japanese plane shot down, 10 Allied aircraft fell from the sky. The kill ratio was 10-1, and it stayed that way month after month. American pilots trained in the latest techniques couldn't stop them. British pilots who had fought over Europe found their tactics useless against the nimble Zeros. The Zero could turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver almost any Allied fighter. Pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain were dying in the Pacific skies. The conventional wisdom said you needed better planes, more training, and perfect military discipline. But none of it was working. The experts in London and Washington looked at Australia's Royal Australian Air Force and saw nothing that impressed them. The RAF had only 3,489 pilots total. Most of them came from backgrounds that made the military brass shake their heads. These weren't polished academy graduates. They were bush pilots who had flown over empty outback desert. They were sheep station flyers who knew every ridge and valley of the Australian wilderness. Some had worked as crop dusters, flying low and fast over farmland. The British commanders called them reckless. American officers said they lacked proper military training. These Australian pilots didn't fly by the book, and everyone knew you had to fly by the book to survive. Air Marshal George Jones was the chief of the RAF, and he spent his days defending his pilots to men who thought they knew better. British commanders would sit in their offices and tell him that his pilots needed more discipline. They needed to learn proper formation flying. They needed to stop taking such crazy risks. Jones would listen and nod, but inside he was thinking something very different. He watched his pilots come back from missions that should have killed them. He saw them land planes that had been shot to pieces. He heard their stories about diving through clouds and skimming treetops and attacking from angles that the training manuals said were impossible. The experts said his pilots were doing everything wrong, but somehow they kept coming back alive. The temperature in the cockpits over Darwin that morning climbed past 110 degrees. Pilots sat in cramped seats, breathing air that tasted like hot metal and fear. Their hands gripped the controls as they watched the massive Japanese formation approach. Every pilot knew the statistics. They knew about the 10-1 kill ratio. They knew that proper tactics said you should maintain altitude, stay in formation, and attack from above. That's what the book said. That's what every training manual taught. But the book was written by men who had never fought Zeros. The book was written for European skies, not the jungles and mountains of the Pacific. And more importantly, the book was getting pilots killed every single day. One evening, after another brutal day of losses, Air Marshal Jones sat in his office staring at the reports. He thought about his pilots and their strange backgrounds. He thought about how they navigated by reading the land below them, not by instruments. He thought about how they had learned to fly in conditions that would ground most military pilots. They flew through dust storms in the outback. They landed on dirt strips barely longer than a football field. They knew how to read clouds and wind and terrain in ways that academy-trained pilots never learned. And then Jones realized something that would change everything. He picked up his pen and wrote in his report, "Our boys don't fly by the book, because the book doesn't work out here." Maybe, he thought, the problem wasn't that his pilots were too wild. Maybe the problem was that everyone else was too rigid. Maybe being different wasn't a weakness. Maybe, in this new kind of war, being different was exactly what they needed. The solution started forming in March 1942 over the jungles of Port Moresby in New Guinea. Squadron 75 was equipped with P-40 Kitty Hawks, planes that most experts said were no match for the Japanese Zero. The Kitty Hawk was heavier and couldn't turn as tight. On paper, it looked like a losing battle before it even started. But the Australian pilots in Squadron 75 didn't care much about what the paper said. They had been watching, thinking, and planning. They knew they couldn't beat the Zero at its own game, so they decided to play a completely different game. Instead of trying to outturn the enemy, they would use speed and surprise. Instead of fighting high in the sky where the Zero had every advantage, they would fight low, hugging the jungle canopy where their skills from flying over the outback would matter most. The new tactics had specific numbers that pilots memorized like prayers. They would fly at 50 to 100 feet above the jungle treetops. This was insane by military standards. Regulations said pilots should fly at 500 feet minimum for safety, but at 50 feet, you became invisible to enemy planes above until the very last second. The Australian pilots would hide behind ridge lines, ducking down into valleys where radar couldn't see them. They would emerge from cloud banks like ghosts, appearing where they shouldn't be. When they attacked, they came in fast, closing at 450 miles per hour. They would fire their guns at 200 yards instead of the standard 400 yards. Getting closer meant more bullets would hit. It also meant more danger, but these pilots had learned in the outback that sometimes you had to take risks to survive. Squadron 75 developed something they called Kitty Hawk Roulette among themselves. It was a head-on attack that made visiting British officers go pale when they heard about it. Instead of turning away from an approaching Zero, the Australian pilots would fly straight at it. Two planes racing toward each other at combined speeds over 600 miles per hour. Most pilots would break off, turning away before collision. But the Australians discovered that if you held your course just a second longer than the enemy expected, you could get a clean shot while they were still deciding what to do. It took nerves of steel and perfect timing. One pilot described it as playing chicken with death at speeds that would give you less than 2 seconds to make your decision. The first real test came in March over Port Moresby. Squadron 75 went up against Japanese formations that had been terrorizing the Pacific for months. When the smoke cleared and the planes landed back at base, the ground crews counted the results with shaking hands. The Australians had achieved a 3-to-1 kill ratio. For every Australian plane lost, 3 Japanese planes fell from the sky. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't a fluke. The tactics were working. By April, the numbers became even more impressive. Over New Guinea, Australian pilots shot down 22 Japanese aircraft. They lost only 4 of their own. The ratio was shifting from 10-to-1 in Japan's favour to something completely different. But success didn't mean acceptance. Back in headquarters, the British air staff looked at the reports and frowned. They sent urgent messages demanding that Australian pilots return to proper formation flying. Proper military discipline required neat formations, aircraft flying in organised groups like birds in a flock. The Australians were breaking formation, attacking alone or in pairs, diving through gaps that shouldn't exist. The British officers said this was dangerous and unprofessional. They ordered Air Marshal Jones to make his pilots follow the rules. Jones read the orders and filed them away. He had seen the results. He knew what worked. Wing Commander John Jackson became the champion of these unorthodox tactics. Jackson had flown in Europe and the Pacific, and he understood both worlds. He stood up in meetings with senior officers and spoke words that could have ended his career. "Train them. Don't restrain them," he said. "These pilots have skills we need to use, not destroy. Let them fly the way they know how to fly. Give them the freedom to adapt and improvise." Jackson argued that the Australian pilots had something that couldn't be taught in any academy. They had instinct developed over thousands of hours flying in conditions that would ground most military pilots. They read the air and land like some people read books. Taking that away to make them fly like everyone else was like cutting off a bird's wings and expecting it to soar. By June 1942, the decision was made. The tactics would become official across all RAF Pacific squadrons. The manuals were rewritten to include techniques that would have been considered court-martial offences just months before. Low-level flying became standard practice. Terrain masking was taught to new pilots. The aggressive hit-and-run attacks that worked in the Kitty Hawk were now part of the official training. Australia's unique advantage was being put to full use. These pilots didn't just know how to fly planes, they knew the land. They had navigated across the Australian outback, where landmarks were hundreds of miles apart. They could read the jungle terrain the same way they read the desert, finding paths and escape routes that other pilots never saw. The airstrips they operated from would have shocked pilots accustomed to proper military bases. These were strips carved out of jungle, barely long enough for a safe landing. Ground crews worked with almost no equipment, patching planes with whatever they could find. Flattened fuel cans became patches for bullet holes. Parachute silk was cut up to repair damaged control surfaces. Mechanics worked through tropical rainstorms and 100-degree heat, keeping planes flying with spare parts scrounged from wrecks and ingenuity born from desperation. The pilots would land, refuel, rearm, and take off again within 30 minutes. There were no comfortable barracks or hot meals. There was just the mission, the sky, and the knowledge that their new way of fighting was finally giving the Allies a chance against an enemy that had seemed unbeatable just months before. The numbers told a story that seemed impossible just months before. From February through April 1942, Australian pilots had struggled against the Japanese Zeros with a kill ratio of 1 to 5. For every Japanese plane they shot down, they lost 5 of their own. It was a bleeding wound that couldn't continue. But something changed in May. The new tactics spread through the squadrons like wildfire. By December 1942, the numbers had flipped completely upside down. Now the kill ratio was 4 to 1 in Australia's favour. For every Australian plane lost, 4 Japanese aircraft fell burning from the sky. The transformation was so dramatic that some officers in Washington and London thought the reports must be wrong. They sent investigators to check if the numbers were real. They were real. The Australian pilots weren't just surviving anymore, they were winning. The Battle of Malone Bay in August and September 1942 became the proving ground where the world would see what these pilots could do. Japanese forces landed on the eastern tip of New Guinea, determined to capture the Allied airbase there. For weeks the battle raged through jungle swamps and muddy beaches. The RAF pilots flew 780 sorties, taking off and landing in conditions that would have grounded most air forces. They flew through monsoon rain so thick you couldn't see 50 feet ahead. They took off from airstrips that were more mud than ground, their wheels throwing up brown spray as they fought for altitude. Day after day, they hammered the Japanese positions, dropping bombs and strafing troops with machine gun fire. When the battle ended, it marked the first time in the entire war that Japanese land forces had been defeated. The pilots had played a crucial role in that victory, and the world was starting to notice. Squadron 75 alone racked up numbers that seemed pulled from adventure stories rather than real combat reports. By the war's end, they would claim 152 confirmed kills. But even more impressive was their survival rate. 54% of their pilots survived the war. Across the rest of the Pacific Theatre, the average survival rate for fighter pilots was 40%. That 14% difference represented real lives, real men who made it home because they fought differently. Each percentage point was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father who climbed out of a cockpit and lived to see another day. The adoption of Australian tactics spread faster than anyone expected. By 1943, American commanders in the Pacific were asking for Australian pilots to train their own squadrons. The USAF, which just a year before had dismissed these bush pilots as undisciplined and reckless, now wanted to learn everything they could teach. 27 RAF squadrons operated across the Pacific Theatre, and wherever they went, other units studied their methods. American General George Kenney, who commanded the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, made a statement that shocked the old guard in Washington. "Give me Australians in old planes over green pilots in new ones," he said. This was a general who had access to the newest aircraft America could build, but he wanted experienced Australian pilots even if they were flying outdated machines. That statement said everything about how the reputation of these pilots had changed. The sounds and sights of this new kind of warfare were unlike anything military observers had seen before. The roar of Allison engines screamed through morning mist hanging over the Owen Stanley Range. Pilots tasted the metallic tang of fear, and sweat inside cockpits heated to 110 degrees. When combat began, the sky filled with the crack and whistle of bullets cutting through air. Traces arced through monsoon rain like deadly fireworks, painting orange and red lines across grey clouds. When a Zero took a direct hit, its wings would fold like paper, crumpling inward before the whole plane tumbled toward the jungle below, trailing black smoke. On the ground, mechanics and ground crews worked at primitive jungle airstrips, their hands black with grease and oil, patching bullet holes with flattened fuel cans hammered into makeshift patches. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the thick, humid air and the rot of jungle vegetation. This was where the war was being fought and won, far from the clean briefing rooms and polished offices where strategies were planned. The Japanese response showed just how much impact these Australian tactics were having. Captured documents after the war revealed assessments written by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist. His words were careful and measured, but their meaning was clear. "Australian pilots demonstrate unusual aggression and adaptability," he wrote. This was high praise from an enemy, an admission that something unexpected was happening in the Pacific skies. Japanese pilots began actively avoiding sectors where they knew RAF squadrons operated. Intelligence reports showed enemy formations changing course when scouts reported Australian markings on approaching aircraft. The hunters had become the hunted. Zero pilots, who had owned the skies for the first year of the war, now received specific warnings in their briefings about low-flying attackers coming from terrain features. The mystique of the Zero was breaking apart. An unexpected consequence emerged from these new tactics that nobody had predicted. The Australian wild fighting style, as some called it, became the foundation for an entirely new approach to air combat. Military strategists studying the Pacific Air War realised that the old rules of engagement needed to be completely rewritten. The Australians had accidentally invented what would later be called modern close air support. Their techniques of flying low, using terrain to hide, attacking quickly and disappearing became the blueprint for how jets would fight in future wars. The rigid formations and high-altitude attacks that dominated early war thinking gave way to flexible, adaptive tactics that emphasized surprise and speed over brute force. By the end of 1943, the transformation was complete across the Pacific. Allied pilots were winning air battles at rates that would have seemed impossible in early 1942. Japanese air superiority had evaporated like morning fog under the sun. And at the heart of this change were the lessons learned from pilots who flew crop dusters over wheat fields and navigated by reading creek beds in the Australian outback. The experts had been wrong. The book had been wrong. Sometimes the best way forward came from people who never learned the rules in the first place, who brought fresh eyes and different experiences to old problems. In the burning skies over the Pacific, that difference had saved thousands of lives and turned the tide of an entire theatre of war. When World War II ended in 1945, military leaders across the world sat down to study what had worked and what hadn't. They looked at every battle, every campaign, every tactic that had been used. And when they examined the air war in the Pacific, they kept coming back to what the Australian pilots had done: the low-level flying, the terrain masking, the quick hit and run attacks. These weren't just tricks that worked in one time and place. These were fundamental changes in how air combat could be fought. As the world moved into the jet age, these Australian tactics became the foundation for an entirely new way of thinking about air warfare. The wild ideas that British commanders had wanted to court-martial in 1942 became required reading in every Air Force academy by 1950. The Cold War brought new threats and new weapons, but the lessons from the Pacific remained relevant. When NATO planners designed strategies for potential nuclear strikes against Soviet targets, they turned to the Australian playbook. Low-level penetration became the standard approach. Pilots would fly fast jets just above the ground, hiding behind mountains and valleys, using terrain to mask their approach from enemy radar. This was exactly what those bush pilots had done in their Kitty Hawks over New Guinea, just faster and with more powerful weapons. The principle remained the same: stay low, use the ground to hide, strike fast, and get out before the enemy knows what hit them. Military bases across Europe and America built training facilities that simulated flying through mountainous terrain at high speed. Pilots spent thousands of hours learning to read the ground the way Australian pilots had read the outback and jungle. The DNA of those 1942 tactics lived on in every low-level strike mission flown for the next 50 years. Modern combat pilot training changed completely because of what happened over the Pacific. The old emphasis on rigid formation flying and following procedures exactly gave way to something more flexible. Today's fighter pilots are taught to adapt and improvise. They learn standard tactics, but then they're encouraged to modify them based on conditions. They're taught to think for themselves, to make split-second decisions without waiting for orders from above. Every major air force in the world now emphasizes adaptability over strict adherence to doctrine. The training manuals actually say that skilled pilots should be able to throw out the manual when the situation demands it. This would have been heresy in 1940. By 1960, it was common sense, and it all traced back to those Australian pilots who refused to follow rules that were getting people killed. Air Marshal George Jones lived to see his vision completely vindicated. The man who had defended his unconventional pilots against critics from London and Washington received a knighthood for his service. He became Sir George Jones, honoured not just for leading the RAF, but for having the courage to trust his instincts when everyone else said he was wrong. He spent his later years giving lectures at military colleges, telling the story of how the RAF found success by embracing what made them different rather than trying to copy everyone else. He would stand at the podium, an old man with sharp eyes, and tell young pilots that sometimes the most important thing you can do is question whether the accepted wisdom actually applies to your situation. Innovation, he would say, often looks like insubordination until it works. Squadron 75 became the most decorated unit in RAF history. The pilots who survived the war came home to parades and medals, but many of them just wanted to get back to normal life. Some returned to flying crop dusters over farmland. Others went back to sheep stations in the outback. They had proven themselves in the most intense combat imaginable, and now they wanted quiet. They had shown the world that background didn't determine capability, that unconventional training could produce exceptional results, that thinking differently was sometimes the only way to survive. But they didn't talk much about it. That was the Australian way. Do the job, come home, move on. The full truth about Japanese assessments of Australian pilots remained classified for decades. It wasn't until 1985 that historians gained access to captured Japanese military documents from the war. Buried in those papers were the reports written by admirals and senior commanders, their honest evaluations of what they faced in the Pacific. Reading those documents was like finding a secret diary that confirmed everything but in the enemy's own words. The Japanese military had been tracking which Allied units they fought and noting differences in tactics and effectiveness. The Australian pilots stood out clearly in their reports. The admissions from Admiral Yamamoto and others showed that the Japanese High Command had been deeply concerned about these aggressive, unpredictable flyers who attacked from impossible angles and refused to follow the patterns other Allied pilots used. For 40 years after the war ended, this confirmation sat in locked filing cabinets. When it finally came to light, it validated what the survivors had always known. They had changed the game, and even the enemy had known it. The story of Australia's pilots teaches us something fundamental about how innovation actually happens. The biggest breakthroughs rarely come from the established experts at the top of their field. They come from outsiders, from people who don't know all the rules yet, or who learned their skills in different contexts. The Australian pilots weren't burdened by years of academy training telling them what couldn't be done. They brought skills from flying over deserts and crop dusting farms, and they applied those skills to problems that seemed unrelated. Geographic knowledge trumped pure technical training. Knowing how to read terrain and weather mattered more than memorizing attack formations. When we look at any field, any challenge, we should remember that the person with the unconventional background might see solutions that the experts miss. Desperation mixed with creativity creates revolutionary change. The Australians were desperate in early 1942. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting with planes that weren't as good as what the enemy had. That desperation forced them to get creative, to throw out the rules and try something new. Throughout history, this pattern repeats. When people have no choice but to innovate, they often discover approaches that work better than the old established methods. Comfortable success breeds repetition. Desperate necessity breeds innovation. We can see this same pattern playing out in conflicts today. In Ukraine, from 2022 through 2024, civilian drone operators became tactical innovators who changed modern warfare. Many of these operators were gamers before the war, people who played video games and flew hobby drones. Military experts initially dismissed them as amateurs. But these gamers brought skills and perspectives that career military officers didn't have. They pioneered new ways of using cheap commercial drones for reconnaissance and attack. They adapted faster than official doctrine could keep up. Just like the Australian pilots 80 years earlier, they succeeded because they didn't know what they supposedly couldn't do. The parallel is striking and teaches us that this isn't just a historical curiosity. This is how human progress works in every generation. Modern military doctrine increasingly values adaptability over standardization because of these lessons. Armed forces around the world now understand that rigid systems break when conditions change. Flexible systems bend and survive. Training programs emphasize critical thinking alongside technical skills. Officers are taught that their job includes knowing when to ignore their orders. This seems contradictory, but it reflects a deep truth learned through hard experience. The book can't cover every situation. The manual can't predict every challenge. At some point, people on the ground have to make decisions based on what they see, not what someone 1,000 miles away wrote in a handbook. The Japanese were right. Australian pilots were different, not because they were born with special talents or had access to secret technology. They were different because when the experts said something was impossible, they said, "Watch this." They were different because they came from backgrounds that taught them skills the military didn't know it needed. They were different because they were willing to risk their careers and their lives on ideas that contradicted accepted wisdom. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in any conflict isn't the newest technology or the biggest army. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the simple refusal to accept that the old rules apply to new problems. In the burning skies over the Pacific, that refusal to conform saved thousands of lives and changed how air combat would be fought forever. The lesson echoes across decades. Stay curious. Question assumptions. Remember that different doesn't mean wrong. And when everyone tells you something can't be done, maybe they're right. But maybe, just maybe, they haven't tried it your way yet.